Okay, tonight's presentation is Just Say No to Useless Maintenance. Our presenter is Mike Busch from Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. Many of you will know Mike as a regular contributor to Sport Aviation. One of the better read columns that we have. I pushed to get Mike in the magazine for several years before it actually happened because I've enjoyed his work for other magazines like Cessna Pilots Association. He was named the National Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year in 2008. Many of you might not know it, but he was a co-founder of AvWeb. He's since gotten out of that area of the business, but continuing to write as time has marched along. Obviously, he's an airframe and power plant mechanic with inspection authorization. And most importantly, probably for us tuning in tonight, he's got over 7,000 hours flying piston aircraft. So he is definitely a guy that knows his stuff when he's talking about GA aircraft, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. So with that, Mike, I want to thank you for joining us tonight.
Oh, you bet, Charlie. Let's see. I guess I need to click a button here.
You got it.
And can you see me?
Everything looks great.
Hopefully you don't see me, but you see what's on my screen.
I see exactly what's on your screen.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Looks like we've got about 180 people in the room right now, and that's great. My name is Mike Busch, as Charlie introduced me, and I'm a regular columnist since the beginning of the year in the new and improved EAA Sport Aviation. The subject for tonight's talk, this is actually a presentation that I first put together for the Forums Plaza at AirVenture 2010. And we're going to try to do it tonight. It's going to be a little challenge because the Forums Plaza presentations are an hour and 15 minutes long, and I guess I'm supposed to fit this into 45 minutes, so I guess I'll have to try to talk fast.
Well, I just want to leave some time for questions at the end, Mike. And by the way,
sure,
for everyone tuning in, we will let this go a little bit longer. So we've got probably an hour and a half total to work with, but I'd still like you to shoot for your 45 minutes.
I will do that. I assume the 45 minutes starts now.
You're on the clock, yes.
In addition to writing a monthly column for Sport Aviation, I spend most of my time these days running a company I started about 3 years ago called Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. We're in the business of providing professionally managed maintenance for owner-flown general aviation aircraft, and in that role we manage a lot of maintenance on a lot of airplanes. In the last 3 years or so, we've probably managed about 400 annual inspections. And the focus of what I'm going to be talking about is mostly stuff that comes up at annual inspections. So I just want you to know that this is hardly theoretical, that we're using the techniques that I'm about to talk about tonight every day. The aircraft that we manage sort of run the gamut of certificated GA piston-powered aircraft, 90% singles, 10% twins. But we manage more Cirrus aircraft than everything else put together for reasons that just have to do with the demographics of Cirrus owners. That they tend to be people that would prefer to hire somebody to manage their maintenance rather than to deal with it themselves. But what we do is no different than what the typical aircraft owner is supposed to do when he manages his own maintenance. And so because we do so many Cirrus annuals, I'm going to focus tonight on a case study involving a Cirrus, but nothing that we talk about is in any way Cirrus specific. I will be talking mostly in the context of certificated aircraft. Things are a little bit different when we're talking about experimentals. I mean, for example, we don't do annuals, we do condition inspections. But a great deal of what I'm going to be talking about also applies to experimentals. And for the purposes of the discussion tonight, I'm going to use as a case study an annual inspection that we got involved in, involving a 2003 Cirrus SR-22 owned by an owner named Alan. I won't mention his last name. But Alan lives in the Portland, Oregon area, and he works up in Seattle, and he uses this airplane pretty much to commute to work, and he sort of just flies up and down from Portland to Seattle and back pretty much every day of the week, and so he flies a lot. This is his commuting vehicle. He bought the airplane 7 years ago. He's got over 1,800 hours on the airplane. In fact, almost 1,900 hours on the airplane, flying about 200 to 300 hours a year. And he had been in habit since buying the airplane of having his annuals done at the Cirrus Service Center up just north of Seattle. And typically, these annuals would cost him $5,000 or $6,000 a year. In 2010, he had to go off on a business trip to India just about the time his annual came. And for some reason or other, he made the decision to put the airplane in the Cirrus Service Center down in the Portland area as opposed to the one up in Seattle that he's been used to doing. So he drops the airplane off at this shop, proceeds to get on a 747 and fly to India on this business trip. Then he sort of got the shock of his life, because about a week later, he gets an email from his shop in Portland giving him an estimate to repair the airplane and make it airworthy, including 89 discrepancies and a repair estimate that pretty much lifted him right off the floor. I'm not sure the slide says whopping. I'm not sure whether that does total justice. But the repair estimate he got was parts and labor combined almost $25,000. That kind of got him. The service center that he put the airplane in, Cirrus Service Center he put the airplane in Portland, was probably the worst Cirrus Service Center in the country. In fact, it was so bad that literally the same week that he dropped off his airplane, Cirrus decertified this service center as a Cirrus Service Center and signed and made a different shop, the Cirrus Service Center. But apparently Alan had not done very much due diligence into the shop, figured it was a Cirrus Service Center, had to be okay, and then a week later he's in India and he gets an email with this $25,000 estimate. At which point I got an email from Alan. I took a look at this estimate that he emailed me, and I'll walk through it with you very quickly. The first line item on the estimate was an annual inspection flat rate. That's just for the inspection part of the inspection of $3,645. That's a little bit high, but it's not out of limits. Typically, the annual inspection on one of these airplanes is somewhere between 25 and 30 hours, and so generally they come in around $3,000 or a little bit less. The 3,600 was high. This particular shop actually included more stuff in their flat rate than most shops, so I didn't consider it to be out of bounds. Then we started getting into the discrepancies and the discrepancy repairs. And let me just run through these quickly with you. These are all the things that were on this estimate from the shop. They wanted to replace all of the flexible fluid hoses, fuel and oil hoses, 5-year replacement recommendation, $1,900. The fuel tank deals, which Cirrus recommended every shock cord and 65 recommended replacement items by want to touch alternator number 1, the primary alternator in the system, which Cirrus recommends every 500 hours, $1,440. The number 2 alternator, which is the standby alternator, $790. That's a recommended 1,700-hour item, and he was at 18 something on it. The propeller recommended TBO on his Macaulay propeller was 6 years or 1,800 hours, whichever comes first, and the overhaul cost is $3,720. It's a three-bladed cost speed propeller. TM for overhaul magnetos every 4 years, $1,700 for the two of them. Main battery, Cirrus calls for replacing the battery every 2 years, $700. That's a pretty pricey battery. Also, they call for replacing the filter in the TKS anti-ice system in the airplane every 2 years, $320 parts and labor combined. Fuel injector nozzle cleaning, which they recommend doing every year, $200. The rubber de-ice boots on the propellers that are part of the TKS system, the shop reported that they were cracking and wanted to replace them for $860. The lower cowling had heat damage in the exhaust trails, and the composite repair charge was estimated at $940. Wing root fairing caps were starting to disbond, cost to reattach them $950. Muffler flame cones were warped, so the shop wanted to replace both the mufflers, $2,280 for new mufflers. The airplane still had its original 121.5 ELT, and the shop suggested that the ELT should be changed to a 406 megahertz unit, since the 121.5s are no longer being monitored. $1,750 was the estimate for doing that. Miscellaneous cosmetic paint touch-up on the airplane estimated at $1,620, and about 50 additional minor squawks, all totaling up to $1,425 for a grand total of $24,730. So, of course, Alan had one of these oh my God moments, which we occasionally have, and did on the management of an annual in the middle of the annual, that if somebody wants their maintenance professionally managed, that they need to sign up with us before the annual starts, because trying to pick up management of something halfway in the middle is generally very difficult. I frankly felt so sorry for Alan that I made the decision we're going to break our own rule and take him on as a client in the middle of this annual. He was off in India. His airplane was in this horrible shop up in Portland, and against my better judgment, we decided to take on. So what do you do in a situation like this? What should Alan have done, you know, in the absence of signing up for a program? Well, you know, what the owner needs to do is just say no to a lot of this stuff. And I'm going to try to know is an extreme part of an aircraft owner's obligations to manage the maintenance of his airplane. Maintenance is not an inherently good thing. Maintenance is a necessary evil. It's a lot like surgery. To do it, don't do it any more than necessary, and you don't get extra credit for doing more maintenance than what's necessary to make the airplane legal and safe and reliable, which is why we do maintenance. More maintenance is not necessarily better. In fact, almost every study that I've looked at indicates that more maintenance is worse, because every time you put your airplane in the shop and let a mechanic attack it with tools, there's a fairly good chance he's going to break something. And there's some marvelous information on it actually to an article that's going to be appearing in a few months called the Waddington Effect, which has to do with some research that that a scientist by the name of Waddington did in Britain during World War II. That showed that that the less maintenance they did on their B-25s, the more uptime they had, and the less unscheduled squawks. And there's some data. There was also tremendous research that was done by the airlines in the late 60s, resulting in a maintenance philosophy called reliability-centered maintenance, which drastically reduced the amount of maintenance that were done on the on airline aircraft, and resulted in a vast improvement in dispatch reliability and safety. But that's a subject for another webinar on another day. In any case, less maintenance, frequently better maintenance. And if you follow the manufacturer's recommendations, first of all, in most cases you don't have to follow them. Manufacturer's recommendations are typically only regulation. If you do follow recommendations, it will often greatly increase the cost of maintenance beyond what is really needed, and often will be actually detrimental to the reliability of the aircraft. And we'll get into some of that in detail here. But it is the owner's job to say no to maintenance. Mechanics will always do maintenance by the book. In other words, do it following manufacturer's recommendations, unless you instruct them not to do that. And the reason they will always do it by the book is because if they take enough to say, well, the manufacturer recommends this, but I don't think that's really necessary, they expose themselves to serious liability in case something goes wrong. And the number of lawsuits against shops and mechanics has absolutely exploded in the last 15 years or so as a kind of an unintended consequence of the General Aviation Revitalization Act of 1994, which basically took manufacturers off the liability hook for aircraft that were more than 18 years old. And doing that didn't make the lawsuits go away. It just meant that everybody other than the manufacturer who has anything to do with the airplane tends to get sued a whole lot more than they used to. And so there's been an explosion in lawsuits against years. As a result, mechanics are reportedly very, very nervous about being sued. And if you were in that position, you'd be nervous too. And so they tend to, much more than say 20 years ago, they tend to do everything exactly by the book unless the owner instructs them not to. If you instruct your mechanic that you do not want something done that the manufacturer recommends, and you do that in writing by providing something in writing saying, I decline whatever this maintenance task is, your written instruction to the mechanic is his get-out-of-jail-free card in the event of a lawsuit, because the reason he did whatever that task was is not because he made not to do it, but because you made the decision not to do it, and that's really who should be making these decisions anyway. It should be the owner's decision, not the mechanic's decision. So unless you say to various maintenance items that the manufacturer recommends, those items are going to be done, and so it's an important maintenance management responsibility to know when to say no and to do that and to do it in writing. Of course, the trick is knowing when to say no, and so that's what we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about, is what the basic rules are about when it's a good idea to say no to something and when it's not such a good idea to say no to something. And then after we've gone through that, I'll return to Alan's airplane and sort of go through that what I thought what did in the way of managing that annual. So let's talk about when it's appropriate to say no to manufacturer recommended maintenance. Prime candidates for saying no to are manufacturers' maintenance intervals. For example, all those 5-year items that Cirrus recommended, that can reasonably be performed on condition instead of being performed on some timetable. Condition-based maintenance, that is maintenance that is performed only when demonstrably necessary on the basis of an inspection, is always far more cost efficient than time-directed maintenance. In fact, that's the big change that the airlines did in the late 60s and early 70s, was to transition from an almost entirely time-directed maintenance program where things were done on a fixed schedule to doing things on a condition-based basis where things were driven by inspection results and maintenance was only done when it was demonstrably necessary. And the result was a gigantic reduction in maintenance cost and a surprising increase in liability. So we always want to do condition-based maintenance when it's feasible to do condition-based maintenance. And the only time we want to do time-directed maintenance is when there's no reasonable way to this condition. So we want to consider ignoring manufacturers' overhaul and replacement times and other kind of arbitrary time-based things, and replace or repair only when inspection shows it to be necessary. The only time we would be doing things on a schedule basis is when there's no reasonable way to assess condition. There's no reasonable inspection that can be done to determine when the work is necessary. Engine, propeller, and other TBOs are excellent candidates for this condition-based approach. I recommend to all of our managed maintenance clients that they should almost completely ignore manufacturers' TBO recommendations. I have practiced what I preach for many, many years. I've been an aircraft owner for more than 4 decades. I presently fly a Cessna Turbo 310 twin, and the engines on my airplane are rapidly approaching 200% of TBO. Eventually, I will overhaul those engines when they start talking to me, but had I overhauled them at the manufacturer's recommended TBO, I would have deprived myself of, I don't know, 10 years of a very reliable operation. It just isn't a sensible thing to do in my view. Another good candidate for saying no to is recommended preventive maintenance that is intended to prevent failures that are acceptable failures. In other words, that where the consequences of those failures are not serious. We need to start thinking about the consequences of failures because not all failures are created equal. The most serious kinds of failures are what are called failures with safety consequences that could hurt or kill somebody, and clearly those sorts of failures are completely unacceptable, and we have to do whatever it takes in maintenance to prevent those sorts of failures from happening. The next level down is what's called failures with operational consequences, which are failures that aren't going to hurt or kill anybody, but might leave you stuck in Sheep Dip, Nebraska on a Saturday night when you really hadn't planned to spend the night in a Motel 6 in Sheep Dip, Nebraska. Those are less serious, but since we typically don't like to be stuck somewhere, it's frequently spending some money in maintenance to try to avoid those sorts of failures. The third level of failures, and the overwhelming majority of equipment failures are of this kind, are called failures with economic consequences. They're failures that won't hurt or kill anybody, that won't leave us stuck somewhere, that simply cost money to fix. Generally, failures with economic consequences should not, it doesn't make sense to spend money in maintenance to prevent them. We simply, the optimum way to deal with failures with economic consequences is simply to run the item to failure and then deal with it when it fails. And that's particularly true if the reason that the failure has only economic consequences is because we have redundancy in the system. Perfect example of this would be vacuum pumps. Vacuum pump manufacturers recommend that the vacuum pumps be retired on a time-based interval, 500 hours to 1,000 hours. Generally speaking, if we're talking about dry vacuum pumps, the failures on those things are so unpredictable and can happen any time, from 10 hours to 2,000 hours, that if we're flying IFR and the vacuum pump is what's keeping our attitude indicator running, then we have to have a backup. We either have to have a second pump, we have to have a standby vacuum system, we have to have a backup electric gyro, something that provides us a way to keep the dirty side down if the vacuum pump fails. Well, if we have that kind of redundancy, and pretty much everybody who flies IFR nowadays does have that sort of redundancy, then the failure of a vacuum pump becomes an acceptable failure. It isn't a safety risk. It's not going to get us stuck anywhere. It's just going to cost us money to fix. So if that's the situation, then it doesn't make sense to be retiring vacuum pumps at 500 hours. We should just be running them to failure. On the Cirrus airplanes that are all-electric airplanes and that have dual batteries and dual alternators, we feel the same way about the alternators. Cirrus recommends frequent prophylactic alternator replacement. To us, that doesn't make sense. The failure of an alternator on a Cirrus is not a safety-critical event. We've got, 3 other electrical sources in the airplane if the main alternator fails. So we recommend running the alternators to failure. In fact, it's even worse with the Cirrus because the alternators that they use, which are Kelly Aerospace alternators, have a horrendously high infant mortality failure history. They frequently fail very early in their lives. So if you have an alternator, a Kelly alternator on your Cirrus that's made it to 500 hours, which is when Cirrus recommends that you replace it, you got one of the good ones. You want to hold on to it. You don't want to replace it. So in any case, preventive maintenance intended to prevent acceptable failures is something generally to be said no to, and we instead should be running those items to failure. Finally, we should always say no to overkill. And what I mean by that is it never makes sense to replace something if it can be rebuilt or overhauled. And it never makes sense to rebuild or overhaul something if it can be repaired. These words all have very, very specific meanings in maintenance, and owners need to tune in to these various words and what they mean, because there can be huge differences in maintenance cost. One of the most important and most underused phrases in maintenance is inspect and repair as necessary, or IRAN. That means when you ask a technician to inspect and repair as necessary, it means inspect the item and repair it in order to make it airworthy, and then stop. If you tell that same technician to overhaul the item, you're removing all discretion from him, because overhaul means he's required to open up the overhaul manual and start on page 1 and go all the way to the end and do everything that the overhaul manual calls for, whether or not it needs to be done. For example, if you ask somebody to overhaul a gyro instrument, he is compelled to replace all the bearings, whether or not the bearings are in good shape or bad shape, because bearings are an unconditional replacement item in the overhaul manual. If you tell him to inspect and repair that gyro as necessary, then he can check out the bearings, and if they're bad, he can replace them, and if they're fine, he can leave them alone. So by using the word overhaul or rebuild, which is even more restrictive, you're removing the discretion from the technician to do just what's needed and then stop. The O word, as I call it, is one of the most overused and costly words in aviation maintenance, and I try to teach my students and my clients not to use the word overhaul unless they really mean it. The difference between an IRAN and an overhaul is frequently a factor of 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10. And so before you ask for something to be overhauled, make sure you really want it to be overhauled. Most of the time, an IRAN is what we want. Okay, those are some ideas of when we should be saying no to things. Let's talk a little bit about when we shouldn't say no. We never say no to maintenance tasks that are required by regulation. So, for example, airworthiness directives. We can't say no to complying with an airworthiness directive because AD compliance is non-negotiable. If we don't comply with airworthiness directives, the airplane is going to be on the ground. We also don't say no to what are called airworthiness limitations. Airworthiness limitations mostly apply to newer aircraft that are certificated under Part 23. Most of the older legacy aircraft, like the one I fly, that were certificated under the old CAR3 regs, don't have airworthiness limitations. Although some of the parts on our older airplanes do, like for example our storage batteries. But if the maintenance manual or instructions for continuing airworthiness for an aircraft or engine or propeller or component has an airworthiness limitations section, then everything in that airworthiness limitations section is compulsory and is required by regulation. And for the Cirrus, an example is that every 10 years, the rocket and the canopy on the cap system, the aircraft parachute system, is required to be, the rocket has to be replaced and the canopy has to be repacked. And this is a fairly expensive item, about a $12,000 item, parts and labor combined, but you have to do it. There isn't a choice. If you have a Cirrus aircraft with a cap system that's more than 10 years old, you've got a very expensive bookend. You can't fly the airplane. So we don't ever say no to that stuff, as painful as it might be. Also, for all aircraft, FAR Part 43 Appendix D specifies a very long laundry list of things that are required to be done at every annual inspection, and for aircraft that are used for carrying passengers for hire, giving flight instruction for hire, every 100-hour inspection. And anything in Part 43 Appendix D is required by regulation, and we have to do it. Simple example, it comes up all the time. We'll have clients put their airplane in the shop for an annual and tell the mechanic, don't bother to change the oil and replace the oil filter because I just did it 5 hours ago. Well, I mean, that sort of seems sensible, but it's not legal because Part 43 Appendix D requires that at every annual inspection, the mechanic cut open the oil filter and inspect it for metal. And so if you did an oil change 5 hours before your annual, the mechanic, unfortunately, is going to have to remove that oil filter and cut it open, which is sort of a silly thing to do after 5 hours. Some mechanics, if you save your oil filter, the old oil filter, and put it in a Ziploc bag and present it to the mechanic and say this oil filter was removed 5 hours ago, some IAs will be willing to cut open and inspect that filter. But he has to have a filter to cut open and inspect in order to comply with the regs in Part 43 Appendix D. And so you can't say no to that. He can't sign off the annual without doing all of that stuff. So we don't say no to things that are required by regulation. Another thing that we at least think long and hard before saying no to is any discrepancy that the IA who's inspecting our airplane considers to be an airworthiness item. An airworthiness item means a discrepancy that rises to the level that the mechanic, that the inspector feels that he cannot declare the aircraft airworthy and approve it for return to service unless that discrepancy is resolved. And there's one of two reasons that an item might be an airworthiness item. One is that he feels that it's not in conformance to its type design. The second is he feels that it's not in condition for safe operation. This is one area where it's a little bit different for experimentals. In experimentals, there's no type design, and so the only criteria is whether it's in condition for safe operation. For certificated aircraft, we have two different criteria we have to meet. It has to conform to its type design. It also has to be in condition for safe operation. Now, the general rule is that if the IA says it's an airworthiness item, we pretty much have to approve the repair. However, there are some IAs that are ultra cautious. There's some other words I could use too, but that call almost everything an airworthiness item. And if you wind up in the regrettable situation of being stuck with an IA like that, who is calling all sorts of minor things airworthiness items, then I would recommend that you go get a second opinion from another IA. And if after getting a second opinion it's clear that that really isn't an airworthiness item, you may want to debate it with the IA, try to convince him to change his mind. And if he's unwilling to change his mind, then you can have the annual signed off with discrepancies on those items you don't want him to repair, and then go get somebody else to look at the airplane and clear the discrepancies. We do that occasionally. It isn't very common. I think in the 400 and some odd annuals we've done over the last 3 years, we've had to have the annual signed off with discrepancy, I think 4 times, maybe 1 out of 100 annuals. So it's not common, but it happens sometimes, and owners should know that that's an option that they have. Okay, so much for the theory now of when to say no and not to say no. Let me return to Alan's $25,000 annual estimate and go through and tell you how we dealt with this shop and dealt with these items. And if you recall, his estimate was $24,730. And by the time we got finished beating up on the shop, we knocked it down to about $8,000. Still a pretty expensive annual, still probably a couple of thousand more than he'd ever spent on an annual before. He certainly learned his lesson about doing due diligence before putting his airplane in a service center he'd never worked with before. But we did save him nearly $17,000 on this annual by appropriately saying no to things. So let me go through and just kind of illustrate for you how we went about doing this. And what we did is not anything that any aircraft owner could not do. In fact, it's exactly what an aircraft owner should do, is go through and decide what to say no to. 5-year flex hose replacement, we didn't exactly say no, but we said let's not do it now. Like most time-based recommendations from the manufacturer, this is only a recommendation, it's not a requirement. Now, flex hoses happen to be one of those things that you really can't do on condition. And the reason is that hoses deteriorate from the inside out. So you can inspect the outside of them all you want, but you can't really tell what their internal condition is going to be. On the other hand, so we have to replace fluid-carrying flex hoses, flammable fluid flex hoses, on some sort of a time basis. We really don't have an alternative. But the 5-year recommendation is a very conservative recommendation that's sort of calibrated to the worst-case aircraft, like most of these time-based recommendations are. And we knew that Alan's aircraft was in much better shape than the average aircraft because it was always hangared and because he flew it with extreme regularity. And based on what we knew about how he flew the airplane, we recommended to Alan that the flex hose replacement be extended to 7 to 10 years rather than the manufacturer recommended 5 years. And he agreed that we would defer this item and do it in a year or 2 or 3. The 5-year fuel drain valve seals, that's a totally silly recommendation. Either the quick drains are leaking or they aren't. If they're leaking and there's blue stains on the hangar floor, we'll try to blow out the drain valves with shop air, which fixes the problem about half the time. And if it's still leaking, then we change the seals. To change the seals on a 5-year basis or any kind of a time basis is just plain silly. Fuel drains don't just automatically, just don't suddenly open up and start draining large quantities of fuel out of the tank. As the seals age, they gradually start to leak, and we start seeing stains on the floor of the hangar. And that's the time to deal with it, not on some fixed basis. So we said, no, let's not do this. Fuel drain seals should be dealt with on condition, not on some fixed timetable. Same thing for the gascolator seals. If they isn't leaking, leave it alone. Aileron rudder shock cord, the same thing. If the aileron rudder shock cord, this is the aileron rudder interconnect, starts to wear out, the airplane will fly a little bit crooked, and you'll know that there's a problem. Even if the shock cord, totally snapped, it wouldn't render the airplane unflyable. It would just render it slightly out of rig. So this is not something that we need to do on a timetable. We do it on condition. I already talked about the alternators. That's an absolutely crazy idea to replace the alternators at 500 hours because of the extremely high infant mortality failure of these alternators. If your alternator made it to 500 hours, it's one of the good ones. You want to hang on to it. We treat alternators as a run-to-failure item on Cirruses because Cirruses have so much redundancy in the electrical department. Same thing for alternator number 2. We treat it as a run-to-failure item. In fact, alternator number 2 is not even a required item. It's only required for IFR flight. So we just run those things to failure. Propeller overhaul, same deal. Macaulay recommends a 6-year overhaul cycle on these propellers because they're worried about corrosion. But an airplane that flies as regularly as Allen's does, that's just a total non-issue. And so we recommended holding off on the prop overhaul, which is it's just a recommendation. It's not a requirement, and to overhaul the prop at the time the engine was overhauled. 4-year overhaul of magnetos is nuts. There's basically nothing in the magneto that deteriorates with calendar time, and that 4-year overhaul is not a required item, and nobody in his right mind would do it. We recommend doing an IRAN every 500 hours, and the IRANs typically cost between $300 and $400 per magneto, a tiny fraction of what an overhaul would cost. The mags on my own airplane, of course I have 4 of them, get religiously IRAN'd every 500 hours. They haven't been overhauled in 20 years since the engine was overhauled, and there's no reason in the world to do that. Battery replacement, a couple of things about this. First of all, even the battery manufacturer does not recommend replacing them on time, although Cirrus does. The battery manufacturer, which is either Teledyne Gill or Concord, recommend replacing them on condition using a capacity test, and there are very specific instructions for continued airworthiness for both brands of batteries, and typically if you follow the battery manufacturer's recommendations, the batteries will last 3 to 5 years. The battery in my airplane is 7 years old. It's still fine, still has plenty of capacity. I'm not about to change it. The second thing about the battery replacement is that the shop wanted $700 for the battery, which is basically list price. That same battery can be bought at Aircraft Spruce by the owner for about $300. There's huge markup on batteries. The markup on batteries is typically 100% markup. And since battery replacement is something that an aircraft owner is allowed to do himself as preventive maintenance, we often recommend to our clients that if they aren't scared of a screwdriver and they know how to take the top cowling off, it's not a bad idea for them to replace their own batteries and save a whole bunch of money doing it. TKS anti-ice filter, we always say no to that. We've never seen a TKS filter come out anything but spotless, because the only thing that ever goes through it is pristine TKS fluid. So what we tell our clients is unless the TKS system is not working properly, or unless you have some reason to believe somebody dumped a Diet Coke in your TKS tank, leave the filter alone. It will probably last the life of the airplane. Annual fuel injector nozzle cleaning. We have a lot of good data on that from the guys down at GAMI in Oklahoma, who are arguably the world's expert on injector nozzles these days. Injector nozzle cleaning almost always causes more problems than it cures, and there's no reason ever to do it on time, because all of these Cirrus airplanes, and frankly most high-performance airplanes these days, have a digital engine monitor that will clearly show if there's a clogged nozzle. If the engine monitor indicates that there's a clogged nozzle, then we will remove only that nozzle and clean it, but we always say no to doing it on a time-based basis, and certainly not doing it every year. The TKS de-ice boots cracking on the propeller, we asked the shop to send us a photograph of it so we could assess how bad it was. We looked at it and determined that the cracking was only cosmetic and that there was no reason to replace the de-ice boots until they got to the point where they were threatening to debond from the propeller, so we declined that item. We also asked for a photo of the lower cowling heat damage, took a look at that photo and decided that the damage was bad enough that it needed to be dealt with. We considered that if it got significantly worse, it could be a safety flight item, so we approved that repair. The same thing with the wing root fairing caps. Unfortunately, Cirrus, in its infinite wisdom, puts those fairing caps on with two-sided tape, and after a while the tape gets bad and the fairings start to despond, and we need to do something about that because we don't want them departing the airplane in flight. So although that was a $1,000 item and it's kind of painful to do, we approved that work because we felt that it was something that needed to be done. The flame combs that were warped, we did approve repairing those, but we instructed the shop, instead of replacing the mufflers, to send the existing mufflers out for repair, which roughly halved the cost of that repair and saved the owner a little over $1,000. On the ELT, we recommended that the owner hold off because the company that makes his existing ELT, which is an ACK model E01, is about to come out. No, they're just waiting for final approvals with an ACK E04, which is the 406 megahertz version of that same ELT, and that if he installs the E04, it will cost him only about 1/3 of the cost of installing the ELT that the shop was recommending, since it's simply a direct drop-in replacement. So we recommended that he hold off. The miscellaneous paint touch-up, we asked the shop to take some pictures. We ran them by the client by a digital photo and email to India. He said, doesn't bother me. We told the shop we didn't want to do those. The 50 additional minor squawks, most of those we wound up saying yes to. I won't go into those, but most of them were things that were worth repairing, and most of them were relatively inexpensive. So we said yes to the majority of those. The bottom line was that the total, the final total invoice came out to be about $8,000, and we saved the client about $17,000 on this annual by judiciously saying no to the appropriate stuff. Now, let me point out that this was a very unusual case, that we don't typically get $25,000 estimates on Cirrus annuals, that this was this one was particularly over the top, and so we were able to save the client an extraordinary amount of money. We don't routinely cut the cost of annual inspections by a factor of 3, although we did in this particular case. But we do routinely reduce the cost of maintenance by thousands of dollars per year for most of our clients, mostly, as I said, by judiciously saying no, and partly by giving them advice as to what shops to use so they don't get in this situation in the first place. But this case that I just went through with you is kind of an extreme case, but I used it because it had an awful lot of instructional stuff in it that I thought you'd find interesting. As I said, this isn't theory. I've been using these techniques, and for the last 20 years I've been teaching them to owners for more than a decade, and for the last 3 years we've been employing them in our managed maintenance program. We've done roughly 400 annuals in the last 3 years, and we consistently save the clients a great deal of money using these techniques. So that's pretty much it. Charlie, can we open it up for comments? And oh, by the way, let me just put up my contact information here. If you guys have questions that you don't want to ask in public and would rather ask me in private, my email address is there. if you're interested in the managed maintenance program we have, the website is there. And also, first Wednesday of every month, I do a free maintenance webinar on various topics, and there's the URL of where you can sign up for future webinars and where you can play back the videos of past webinars that I've done. They're free. They're on a different maintenance subject every month, and I would encourage anybody interested to participate in the webinars or to view the videos of the ones that are already completed. Charlie, it's yours.
Okay, Mike. Well, first of all, I want to apologize to everybody in the audience. We had a significant number of audio glitches early on in the presentation, Mike, which detracted, from the first part of the presentation. Luckily, it smoothed out. I think it was an internet connection issue, but that's the first time I've ever experienced it, and it was quite frustrating on my end as well. So I want to thank everybody that stuck with us. Still have over 185 people on, and I don't know whether it'll show up in the recording or not, but let's go ahead and move over to some questions.
Sorry about that, Charlie. I'm actually on a hard T1 connection, so
yeah,
I can't account for that.
I don't know what to say either, but let's go ahead and get to the questions. We got a few good ones lined up, and we're going to have enough time to take a few more too, so don't be hesitant to send something in. Shannon writes, I'm on the board of directors for a flying club, and she thinks that she might use the same shop that you were using as your bad example, but she says there's a great hesitation to say no to, any shop because of fear that the club will somehow be held liable. In other words, choosing money over, quote unquote safety. Is there any way around this, or is that kind of the role that Savvy, your company Savvy Maintenance provides? I mean, well, to give that third party opinion of yes, this is legitimate work and this isn't.
I see that sort of thing all the time, Charlie. When owners make maintenance decisions based on fear, they usually make bad decisions. And I always encourage owners that any time they have any question whatsoever about the advice that they get, they're getting from their mechanic, that they should always seek out an expert second opinion. For the last 20 years, I've been actively involved with a number of the large type clubs, the Cessna Pilots Association, American Bonanza Society, and the Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association. Type clubs are a great place to go for qualified expert second opinions. First of all, every owner of a certificated aircraft should belong to his type club. It's the best $50 a year or whatever that you could possibly spend on your aircraft. And the type club is typically a terrific source of expert second opinions on maintenance subjects. Obviously, for people that are members of our managed maintenance program, we provide them with the second opinions. But I answer 100 emails a week from people asking advice, and I'm happy to do that. But always go get a second opinion anytime you're even the slightest bit uncomfortable about what your mechanic is telling you. And as a second opinion giver, half the time I'll say, I think your mechanic's giving you good advice and I think you ought to follow it. And the other half of the time I'll say, I think your mechanic is being a horse's ass and you probably ought to go find another one. But getting a second opinion is always a very, very good idea.
Okay, Colleen has a question. She says, I totally agree with your condition-based maintenance approach. However, I've heard you state that magnetos are an exception, that they should be IRAN'd every 500 hours. Why do you treat mags differently than other aircraft components?
That's a terrific question, and the answer is really a two-part answer. The first thing is, and I think I made the point, that we have to do time-based maintenance when there is no good way to assess condition. Magnetos are one of those things. A mechanic cannot determine the condition of your magneto without taking it all apart. There's no You can't do oil analysis. You can't check the filter for metal. You can't stick a borescope into a magneto. It's basically a black box, and there's really no way for a mechanic to determine its condition through inspection other than taking the magneto off the airplane and disassembling it to its basic components. So we have to do that on a time basis simply because there's no alternative. It's kind of like what I was saying about hoses. You can look at the hoses all you want, but you can't tell what's going on inside the hose, and that's really where the deterioration occurs. So that's one reason. The second reason, the second part of the answer is you might argue that, well, gee, we have two magnetos. We've got redundancy. So why isn't a magneto failure simply a failure with economic consequences since we've got a backup? If we can run vacuum pumps to failure, why can't we run magnetos to failure? That would be a very perceptive question, and the answer is that some of the magneto failures are ones that can destroy an engine, even though we have a second magneto that's working just fine. One of the failures we frequently see, for example, is failure of the distributor gear in the magneto, which is a plastic gear, and if it fails by teeth stripping off of it, the magneto can suddenly start firing the spark at very bizarre times, and can literally blow up cylinders with pre-ignition events. And so even though we have two magnetos, the fact that they have certain failure modes that can be very, very harmful to our engines means that having two of them is not sufficient. We still have to do regular preventive maintenance on the magnetos, and we can't run them to failure without taking more risk than I guess I'd like to see.
Okay, Mark has a question. During the overhaul of my engine, what is your thought on new or rebuilding the old cylinders?
My thought about new or rebuilding the cylinders, first of all, I would need to know what the history of the cylinders are, because cylinders basically have two components to them. There's a steel barrel and there's an aluminum alloy head that are mated at the head to barrel junction. The barrel is a very simple device, and its airworthiness is simply a factor of its dimensions. If it's within service limits, it's airworthy. If it's beyond service limits, it's not airworthy. The cylinder head is much more complicated. The cylinder head, because it's made of non-ferrous metal, has a finite fatigue life. And the more hours we put on a cylinder head, the more likely that cylinder head is to develop repetitive stress fatigue cracks. So if the cylinder is a first-run cylinder that has, say, 2,000 hours or less on it, it's a reasonable candidate for reuse. But if it's a cylinder that has, 5,000 or 6,000 hours on it, the heads are just too far along in their fatigue life to be comfortable reusing them. So that's one consideration. The other consideration is that, back when I first became an aircraft owner in the late 60s, we used to reuse cylinders a lot at overhaul. We tend not to do that nearly as much anymore, and the reason is that the cost of new cylinders has declined so dramatically that there is much less to be saved by overhauling an existing cylinder compared to buying a new one. The cost of cylinders in constant dollars is literally half of what it was in the 70s. And that's happened for two reasons. One is that cylinder manufacture is almost completely automated now. There's almost no labor involved. And the second reason is that there's a lot of competition. Back in the 70s, if you had a TCM engine, you had to buy your cylinders from TCM. If you had a Lycoming engine, you had to buy it from Lycoming. Now you can buy cylinders from ECI and Superior, and that competition has drastically reduced the cost of new cylinders. So I guess my final answer is, if the cylinders are low time, it's reasonable to consider reusing them, but the chances are you're not going to save huge amounts of money the way you might have done if it was 20 years ago.
Okay, and Robert has a question on how long or how low should one run brake pucks?
How low should one run brake linings.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's I don't know which brakes we're talking about, but if they're the common Cleveland brakes that are used on most GA aircraft, Cleveland has a very specific specification on those. For most brake linings, I think their spec is that there has to be 0.10 inch, in other words, 1/10 of an inch of lining remaining, and the brake linings should be measured with a micrometer and retired when the lining gets thinner than what it's allowed. Also, there's a minimum thickness allowed on the brake disc, and the discs need to be retired when they get to minimum thickness. But that's just a kind of a hard cut and dried answer. It's written right in the specs from the brake manufacturer.
All right, and Brian just spent $8,000 on a 5-year DA40 annual. Does this seem high?
He spent how much?
$8,000.
That's a little high. I'd have to see what they did. And by the way, Brian, if you would like to send me a PDF of your annual invoice, I would be glad to take a look at it and email you back with some comments. But I suspect that if it was an $8,000 annual, the chances are that there was a lot of there were a lot of time-based items that were done that we might have said no to. On the other hand, without looking at the invoice, I really can't tell what was done on that annual. If you had a close encounter with a hanger of the wrong kind and there was a bunch of composite work done to fix up your wing, then maybe the $8,000 is reasonable. But I'd be happy to take a look at your invoice and email you back my impressions.
Okay, and Walter would like to know, do Flying Club airplanes require a 100-hour inspection?
Good question. The regulation that establishes that is 91-409. You can take a look that up on the web. And what it says is that 100-hour inspections are required only under two circumstances. One is if the aircraft is used to carry passengers for hire, and the other is if the aircraft is used to give flight instruction for hire, where the provider of the aircraft is providing the instruction. So the bottom line is that most flying clubs do not have to do 100-hour inspections because they don't meet either of those two conditions. And once again, you want to look up the reg, which is 91-409. That will give you the exact language. But the chances are that if this is a typical flying club where people buy a share in the club and pay some kind of dues and get to fly the airplane, the chances are that you're not required to do 100-hour inspections.
Okay, Charles has what I think is a pretty good question here. Once an A&P has the plane opened up and it's not flyable and a disagreement arises, how can I obtain a second opinion considering that I can't bring it anywhere?
Well, excellent question. First of all, most second opinions don't require physical access to the airplane. We manage hundreds of airplanes all over the United States, a fair number in overseas, in fact. We never look at those airplanes. We never have physical contact with the airplanes. In today's world, all you need to do is ask for some high-resolution digital photographs to be emailed to you. For the last 20 years, I've done tech support for Cessna Pilots Association. I never see any of the airplanes that I help out on and that I give second opinions on. It's really not necessary anymore. Today, we've got we've got knowledge projecting technologies that render physical access to the airplane pretty moot. So it's not really a problem in 99.9% of the cases. A photo is typically all we need to see.
Okay, Bob would like to know what you recommend for an oil change period, and do you recommend an oil analysis on each change?
Okay, oil change period for aircraft that have a full flow oil filter. We normally recommend 50 hours or 4 calendar months, whichever comes first. If the aircraft it operates in a dirty environment, or if the oil analysis results have been questionable and we're concerned about wear metals, we will typically shorten that oil change interval. If we shorten it because of oil analysis, we'll keep it short until the wear metals normalize, and then we'll return it to a standard oil change interval. If the engine does not have a full flow filter on it, if it's an engine that just has an oil screen, then we wouldn't want to run it more than 25 hours between oil changes. And if you do not have a full flow filter, I would heartily recommend that you retrofit one. Retrofit kits are available for literally every aircraft engine that was originally delivered without a full flow filter. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Did you address oil analysis?
No, thank you. I knew there was something I forgot. I'm a very big believer in oil analysis. We do submit oil analysis samples at every oil change. We use Blackstone Laboratories up in Iowa. We think they're the best aviation lab in the business, and all of the aircraft that we manage are on an oil analysis program, and a sample is taken and sent in for analysis at every oil change.
Okay, and Paul would like you to clarify the point on time. Are you referring calendar time versus hourly time? And he says, as with the MAGs.
When I talk about time-based maintenance, it can be either a calendar time limit, for example, or calendar time recommendations, such as, for example, the 6-year recommendation on the Hartzell prop overhaul, which we declined. Or it can be an operating a time in service, a time in hours, like the 500-hour MAG IRANs. When we talk about time-based maintenance, that includes both calendar time based things and time in service based things as well.
Okay, Tony has a 2,000-hour 0320 engine in an experimental aircraft, good compression, good oil pressure. What's the downside of keeping it in service?
No downside at all. 0320 is probably the most bulletproof engine has ever been built. I mean, aircraft engine anyway. And we've seen 0320s go 4,000 or 5,000 hours without being torn down. I personally consider it to be a capital offense to tear down a perfectly good running engine. On the other hand, go on maintenance, you have basically made a commitment to use the best state-of-the-art condition monitoring available. So if you're going to be running that engine past TBO, you should be doing filter inspections, you should be doing oil analysis, you should be doing bore scope inspections, using all of the tools that we have to monitor engine condition. And then when the engine needs to be torn down, it'll start to talk to you.
Okay, Richard has a question. Does a cylinder need to be bore scoped during the annual?
It's not required by regulation. It should be, but it isn't. We require it to be done at every annual on all the airplanes we manage. Most shops do not include a bore scope inspection in their annual inspection flat rate. Normally, if the spark plugs are out, which they would always be at annual because you have to do a compression test, doing a bore scope inspection will require no more than an extra hour of labor, and in my view, it's an hour very, very, very well spent. So we do require bore scope inspections for at every annual for the aircraft we manage, but it is not required by regulation, and most shops won't do it unless you ask.
Okay, good follow-on question. John wants to know your opinion on the new video scopes versus a traditional bore scope.
Well, we love the video scope simply because if a shop uses a video scope to do their bore scope inspection, we get an opportunity to ask them to send us the pictures so that we can render a second opinion on what they see. One of the problems is that very few mechanics have any training whatsoever in interpreting bore scope images. This is not a subject that's taught in A&P school, and most mechanics, if they know anything about it at all, have learned on the job, and depending on who they were apprenticed to, they either learned it right or they learned it wrong. So we would much rather be able to look at the bore scope images ourselves before approving, for example, cylinder removal. And the video scopes all have the capability of capturing digital images and emailing them and so on. So we really like those.
Okay, another good following question from Tony. What kinds of engine defects will a bore scope detect, assuming it's used properly?
Yeah, the bore scope is the best tool we have for determining cylinder condition. The most important thing we focus on is looking at the exhaust valves, which is the most common failure item, cylinder failure item, and the only one that really presents a safety threat is the failure of an exhaust valve. And by looking at the exhaust valve and looking at the pattern of exhaust deposits that are on the valve face, we can tell definitively whether that valve is burning and leaking or not, in a way that is much more reliable than a compression test or any other tool that we have. By the way, one of the webinars that I did that's on that webinar website that's on the screen right now is one that was called All About Cylinders, and it has a ton of bore scope images that show good cylinders and bad cylinders and what good exhaust valves look like and bad exhaust valves and so on. And so if you're interested in bore scope interpretation, that would be a good webinar to take, just because it's got a lot of really good examples of pictures. And I wish I could get mechanics to go through that, because a lot of mechanics need some training in how to interpret what they see under the bore scope. Besides the exhaust valves, the other thing that the bore scope lets us do is get a real good look at the cylinder barrel. And if there are areas of excessive wear, it's very easy to tell under the bore scope. If there are vertical scoring that might indicate, for example, a broken ring, again, that's very easy to detect under the bore scope. We can look at the piston crown with the bore scope, and if there's been detonation in that cylinder, it will be very clear when looking at the piston crown. So there's a lot of really good stuff that we can determine through a bore scope inspection. But the most important thing we look for, and the first thing we look for, is the condition of the exhaust valves.
Okay, and another follow-on question on bore scopes from Larry. Are the 7400 pixel fiber optic scopes sufficient for bore scope inspections?
Generally, I recommend against using fiber optic scopes, and the reason is that unless you spend a great deal of money on a fiber optic scope, the fiber optics tend to have a small number of large fibers as opposed to a large number of small fibers that you'd find in the $10,000 scopes. And the image tends to be very rough and very pixelated. And there's no particular advantage to having fiber optics when doing a bore scope inspection on a piston aircraft engine, because there's no need to flex around anything. All we need is a nice straight probe with a 90-degree prism at the end of it, so that we have a 90-degree view. I think if you look at the All About Cylinders webinar that I have up, it discusses various kinds of bore scopes that I recommend, or feel free to drop me an email. I'll be glad to give you some recommendations. But generally speaking, we would recommend against using fiber optics, because unless you spend a great deal of money, you're not going to get a decent image.
Okay, Walter would like to know, does the annual inspection require that everything is repaired before the logbook is signed, that the annual inspection is complete?
Not exactly. The annual inspection is an inspection, and it's basically a pass-fail inspection. If you look at the regs, that's how it's written. When you have an IA do an annual inspection, there are two possible outcomes. One is a logbook entry that says, I certify that this aircraft has been inspected in accordance with an annual inspection and has been determined to be in airworthy condition, signed off by the IA. That is an approval for return to service. The other possibility is a disapproval for return to service. That is an annual logbook entry that uses a different set of magic words. I certify that this aircraft has been inspected in accordance with an annual inspection, and a list of discrepancies and airworthiness items has been dated such and such has been given to the aircraft owner or operator. That is an annual inspection in which, for some reason, one or more airworthiness items has not been repaired, generally because you directed the shop not to repair them. And instead of getting an approval for return to service, you get a disapproval for return to service, and you get a list of one or more discrepancies. At that point, the annual inspection is over. The IA's job is done. You never have to go back to that shop ever again if you don't want to. You have an airplane with one or more discrepancies, and you deal with it in exactly the same way as you would if you had an airplane in the middle of the year with a discrepancy. Let's say a flat tire. You can't fly an airplane with a flat tire or any other discrepancy, because FAR 91.7 says no person shall fly an aircraft, civil aircraft, unless it's in airworthy condition. So you have to restore it to airworthy condition, but you can get anybody you want to restore it to airworthy condition. It doesn't have to be an IA, and it certainly doesn't have to be the shop that did the inspection. So I hope that answers the question. This whole business about signing off an annual with discrepancies is one that most owners are not ever taught about, but it actually is an extremely important tool because it is the way that if your airplane is in the middle of an annual and you get into a disagreement with the IA that can't be resolved amicably, that's your get my airplane out of jail free card. You simply direct the IA to sign off the annual discrepancies. He proceeds to make the second kind of logbook entry, hand you a list of discrepancies, and then you pay the bill, you get your airplane back, and it's your job to get the discrepancy cleared by whoever you want to get the discrepancy cleared by. From time to time, you may need to get a ferry permit to fly the airplane to a different airport to get the discrepancy cleared. In our experience, the IA who signed off the annual discrepancies is almost always anxious to help you get that ferry permit because he wants you out of his shop just as bad as you want to get out of his shop. And so it's not a problem. We've never had a problem getting a ferry permit. So does that answer the question, hopefully?
I think that took care of it. Ryan would just ask you to repeat the name of the oil analysis lab.
Oh, Blackstone Labs. It's actually Blackstone Laboratories, and the URL is Blackstone, BLACKSTONE -labs.com.
Great. And Ed would like to know your feelings on oil additives such as AvBlend or CamGuard.
The real short answer is if you go to my webinar page, there's another webinar called All About Oil that goes into that in exhaustive detail. The shorter answer is CamGuard is an excellent product. I use it. I've been using it myself in my own airplane for 3 years. We use it in almost all of the aircraft that we manage. AvBlend, we did extensive tests on when it first came out, and actually ran some twin-engine airplanes with the AvBlend in one engine and not in the other engine, did oil analysis, could not tell in the oil analysis which was the treated engine. I don't believe AvBlend does any harm. So if it gives you a warm fuzzy feeling to use it, then by all means use it. But I've never seen any evidence that it actually does any good either. And we did test it quite extensively years ago when it first came out.
Okay, Ray has a 59 Bonanza where the wing bolts have never been changed. Aircraft has no corrosion issues. Do they really need to be changed? About 2,400 hours on the airframe.
They do not need to be changed. In fact, I can, if he sends me an email, I'll be glad to send him ABS's position on this. But the wing bolt replacement is not required by regulation. And the recommendation of the American Bonanza Society is, Hawker Beach, if I recall the shop manual correctly, calls for removing and magnafluxing the bolts every 5 years and replacing them every 15 years, if memory serves me correctly. ABS recommends against removing the bolts for magnaflux inspection unless there is either visible corrosion on the exposed bolt head or there's evidence that the bathtub fitting drain hole has plugged up and the bolts have been sitting in a pool of water. I believe they say that in their opinion, it's not a bad idea to pull the bolts at 20 years, which is like 4 times what Hawker Beach recommends. But it is certainly not required by regulation. It is also a true fact that in the 55 or so year history of the Beach Bonanza, there has never been a single wing bolt failure. In fact, even in the T-34s that pulled their wings off during overstress, and there have been several of those, the wing bolts never broke. It was the wing spar near the bathtub fitting attachments that broke, but the wing bolts remained intact even under gross overstress, and most of those were very old airplanes. So if it were my airplane, I'd leave the bolts alone.
Okay, Roger had a filter adapter installed on his 0200 engine several years ago, but the STC paperwork was never filed with the FSDO. At his last annual with a new mechanic, the IA insisted to remove the filter system because he did not put it in, nor would he recommend it because, quote, it didn't do any good as very little oil actually flowed through it, end quote. Can you comment?
Well, I guess this is a family group, so I'll try to keep it down. It was a very good idea to install the oil filter adapter. The IA is absolutely nuts about it's not being useful. At the same time, clearly the 337 should have been filed, but we routinely run into airplanes that have had STC items installed and we can't find any evidence of a 337. And it's not a problem. You simply ask your IA to file a 337, even if it's 10 years later. And the 337 will typically say that the item was installed pursuant to STC, whatever the STC number is, by persons unknown at times unknown, and signed off by your IA, who presumably has inspected it and determined that it was installed correctly, and that's the end of the story. To insist that it be removed is absolutely nuts. I suggest you find another IA.
Okay, and let's see. David had a question. Can prop bolts be reused, and if so, how many times? He's got a fixed pitch Lycoming 0320.
I have to plead ignorance on that. I don't know enough about fixed pitch props to give you a definitive answer on that. My instinct says that whether or not it's permissible to reuse them, it wouldn't make sense to reuse them. But my maintenance experience is almost exclusively with higher performance aircraft with controllable pitch props, and so I can't really give you a definitive answer to that. I'm sorry. Okay.
Well, Mike, it's about that time. If someone, and I still have a lot of questions left, if they still feel strongly about asking you their question, can they send you an email?
Even if they feel weakly about it, they can. No,
Okay.
I'd be happy to answer questions, and I'd be happy to help any of you guys out at any point in the future. If you need a second opinion or a sanity check or something, I do that all the time, and I enjoy doing it. And feel free to drop me an email. I'm a very good email correspondent. I generally respond right away. So absolutely, that would be just fine.
Excellent. Well, Mike, thanks for doing a great job tonight. I do want to apologize to everyone, including you, that we had some audio problems, but we still had just about everybody stuck with us through the difficulty, and it did smooth out as we went along. But great presentation, one that I've always had on the list. You know, I always see the ones that you offer every year at AirVenture, and I'm like, I got to go to those, and then of course, because I work here, I never get the time to go watch any of the forums during the fly-in. But this is a great opportunity for people that missed it during AirVenture to take it in at their leisure, so to speak. So we really appreciate you doing this, and I think you're doing an excellent job writing for the magazine too.
Well, thank you, Charlie. And if you'd like to sign me up for doing another one of these in a few months or something, I would be happy to do it.
Well, I'm going to be planning the spring schedule here shortly, so I will take you up on that offer because I know this topic and all the ones you cover are of great interest. We had over 200 people on tonight, so that tells you we're definitely on the right track. So with that, I want to thank you again, Mike, and thank everybody else for bearing with us tonight with the audio problems, and hopefully you'll tune into a future webinar, and thanks for being an EA member. Good night.
Good night, everybody.